Welcome to Footnotes, a podcast of Broadway Baptist Church in South Haven, Mississippi. For more information, you can visit us at broadwaychurch.org. And now, Footnotes. And welcome back to the podcast. I'm joined today with Pastor Jake and Pastor Brando Calrissian.
Yeah.
And J2D2. Here we are. So, guys, we're going to talk about community today and the need to have a biblical community. Now, we would agree that this is a very proper, beneficial, biblical pursuit for God's people to come together in a spiritual community. So that kind of undergirds all that we do here at Broadway. Several past podcasts that we've talked about, virtual church, we lamented that you don't have community. So what we want to do on this episode is talk about biblical community and talk about what the church cannot really give you if you're looking for a particular type of community, but what the church can give you if you're open to biblical community. All right? Those are going to be the two questions that center our discussion today. So, guys, biblical community, let's talk first what the church can't really give. So, when we're talking about getting people together, coming to church, there's a particular type of community that churches try to give out, but in all honesty, they don't do a good job of it, and it's not really what God calls us to do. So, Brandon, why don't you talk about that? Because you love the book Compelling Community, and Jamie Dunlop does a good job in that book, Compelling Community, defining those two elements that churches struggle with. And what are they? Come on, you know them off the top of your head, don't you?
It would be a consumer versus prosumer. That's terrible.
Remember, it was gospel plus.
Oh, gospel plus versus
and then it
gospel only. Gospel
or driven or something.
Gospel only community.
Anybody want to get the book and look it up?
Yeah, but we need to look this up.
It's gospel plus or gospel centered.
Yeah,
right?
So for all the listeners, go get the book and read it, and then you can correct us next week after listening.
Well, and we do want you to know that we gave this book out at our volunteer banquet at Christmas, and we have multiple copies in the Book Nook. So if you're looking for a good book to read on community, Jamie Dunlop's Compelling Community is a great book. But in that book, he kind of distinguishes that churches are built on gospel plus. So they have the gospel, but they also build community around all these extra things that unite people. So a singles ministry, a college ministry, a married ministry, a senior adult ministry. Now, there's nothing wrong necessarily with having some of these plus ministries, right? But then Dunlop goes into the book and says, but really that's not the church's ultimate mission, is to segregate people and put them in these additional communities. The goal is to have people come together around the gospel. And so that is going to mean that you're going to have intergenerational fellowship. You're going to have singles and married. You're going to have potentially, all different kinds of people and groups that are not built on their plus, they're built on the gospel, right? That's what unifies your community. That's what unifies your church. So let's talk for just a moment with that in mind. When people come to a church, they're looking honestly for gospel plus, right? So let's talk about that for a moment. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think a good way to understand gospel plus is to really understand kind of that almost seeker-sensitive movement that was around, 30 years ago. And then you had a counter movement of, we need to not be seeker-sensitive. And basically a good way to think about it is there's this idea that, the more people we can get in the door as a church, the more people we can affect with the gospel. So we need to do whatever we can think of to try and get people in the door. And so a lot of churches fell into this gospel plus mentality of thinking if we can create these other communities, these other ministries that are gospel adjacent, it'll get people in the door, and then we can reach them for the gospel. And you end up with a lot of churches that are honestly really shallow and that don't have gospel-centered communities. But then you also have on the flip side a lot of churches, and I've worked at several really small rural churches. My first church was Woodland Baptist Church, and it was a small rural church, and they were not a seeker-sensitive gospel plus church. I would say they were on the other end of the extreme of saying we don't want to do anything that is not completely gospel central. And sometimes that also can be a problem when we become too focused on not doing things to where sometimes your church will consist of the Sunday morning service and that's it. And they don't have any kind of realm or avenue for any kind of fellowship, for any kind of community. And so the reaction from people was always, I visited that church and the service was nice, but I never really felt plugged in. I never was able to get connected. And so I think what we're trying to articulate and what the book, Compelling Community, really is trying to communicate is that we need to figure out a way to facilitate community in our church without it becoming a gospel plus church, with it still being gospel centered. And that's a really hard balance to achieve. And just as a minister, I'm just going to confess, sometimes we make mistakes in trying to find the right area in that. I think a good example of that in youth and children ministry would be like Upwards Basketball, right? Upwards Basketball it's a great idea. It's a great ministry. It was real popular a few years ago. The idea that, hey, if we can have a youth basketball league, we can become the center. We can become the center of community, and we can use that to reach people. And Upwards Basketball is a great thing, but if the church ever starts thinking or focusing too much on Upwards Basketball and not enough on the actual gospel, then it can slide into that era of, this is a gospel plus church. On the other hand, if the church says, no, we don't want to facilitate any community, then you end up with the church with a huge, nice gym that never, ever gets used because they're like, well, we don't care about facilitating community.
Well, and to go back to your point about, the seeker-driven churches, a lot of that was built on pragmatism. So do whatever it takes, whatever works to get people together and in the door. The problem with that, and this is really what the church can't give, ultimately, what the church gets into, there's a limit on the number of plus communities that a church can facilitate. I mean, you can't indefinitely reach every group that could possibly come through your door, or for that matter, that is in your church begging for community. So we hear this a lot right here. Okay, people will hear a lot. What do you have for blank age group? And we may have something for blank age group. We may have a Sunday school class, but they want more than that. They want not only a class, they want some kind of extra thing that would happen outside of Sunday morning, and there needs to be a minister dedicated to whatever blank ministry that I'm a part of and I think is important and valuable, and there needs to be all these extra activities based around blank. And so we will hear this from time to time. Examples, and these are not wrong, right? They're not wrong. We're not saying that it's wrong to have a mother's group or a married class or a college group or whatever. But we hear this a lot, well, you don't have a singles ministry. You don't have a college ministry. And we actually do, okay? We do actually have a college Sunday school class, but they're wanting like a devoted minister and a particular thing that is carved out. And the problem that gets into this is there's no way any church, unless the church is 50,000 people and you have infinite resources and all the time in the world, you're not going to be able to reach every subgroup that is out there. So if we approach church with there's got to be a segregated segment of society that I particularly like and fit in, then we're coming at it from the wrong presumption to begin with. And we're asking the church to do something that it really can't do. And biblically, it's not called to do. So it would never end. You would just keep adding ministries indefinitely. It would wear people out. It would grow thin. You would run out of resources. So the church can't always offer every possible plus. And that's something that people still have not caught on to because they're still asking. So, for example, when I came in view of a call, we had a question and answer night on the Thursday week that I was here with the leadership of the church. And this would have been Sunday school teachers, deacons, anybody, everybody. It was a pretty large group. It was in the fellowship hall. And one of the questions submitted to me was, what are you, pastor, going to do about the young adult ministry? Surely you have a plan and you're going to come up with some kind of plan for this young adult ministry because we don't have anything here. So my answer that I'm not really sure how it fell, to be real honest with you. I think people kind of shook their head like, okay, but I could tell, you can just tell. And this is not an insult on anyone. I mean, first time calf comes to a new gate, they stare at it, right? And so you expect a little bit of that. Calf comes to a new gate, never heard this before. They're going to stare at it for a minute. But my answer was, well, I don't know that we should even try to attempt creating some new ministry. I think what we need to do is tell the older women to disciple the younger women and the older men to disciple the younger men, which is the Titus 2 model that you see in the Bible. So if you do have a single lady, let a married lady with kids invite that single lady over for dinner. Invite her into her home. Let the single lady see what it's like to raise kids. Because maybe in a few years, the single lady is going to be in that position. And so she needs to see it modeled. She needs to see it displayed and demonstrated. Let a young man who says, I'm looking for a group. Who's my group? Well, your group doesn't have to necessarily be people your age. And people your age are fine, and you should hang out with people your age. You should hang out with people in your life sphere and span and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, we all need more than the people that are our age. A bunch of college guys, that's good that they hang out on Friday night and play Catan, but they need more than that. They need maturity that a bunch of college guys is not going to give one another, maybe. So they need maybe an older man who can say to them, yeah, I know what it's like to be your age. I know what it's like to start a career. I know what it's like to raise a family. Man, why don't you come to my workshop in the backyard, help me make this thing with wood, or why don't we do, let's go fishing together. They develop a relationship. It's a biblical gospel relationship within the church. And what happens is there's an organic relationship with other people in the church that may or may not be your age, that may or may not be like you. So when I said that answer in that meeting, I don't know that people fully got it. It was like, and okay, so what are we going to do for the young people? What's your plan? And I'm like, I think the plan is that we're intergenerational, that we get to know one another, that we love one another, we do life together as a church first. Now, if we get to the place where we're big enough and we have the resources, sure, nothing wrong with having a small group or a Friday night gathering or whatever. But I think that a lot of people approach church in the complete opposite direction. Instead of coming at it from Titus 2 and starting with, I want to belong to this community. I want to get to know young and old. I want to be around people my age and older than my age. And I want to learn from everybody in the body of Christ. Instead of starting there, we start from a consumer mindset that says, what do you offer me? what do you have for my age group and me and what I'm looking for today? And I just think that that's the wrong place to start. I think that's the place of immaturity, honestly. And so I think the Bible calls us to start from that different angle of Titus 2. So when people come to the church and it's like kind of this nice demand, what are we going to offer this group? I never really jump at that. My response is, well, how about we offer them the church? So, Brandon?
Yeah, no, I agree. And that goes back to, I guess, my 2 words at the beginning. That was also in the book, but not the words you're looking for.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
okay.
These are not the droids you're looking for.
Aha.
But I think it comes down to 2 things.
Move along.
Yes, it comes down to 2 things. The first is focus, and the second is structure. So I think the first thing, when you talk about this consumeristic mindset versus like a prosumer, or you are actively engaged, participating in the community, that gospel centeredness, the focus when you're in a consumeristic church is on yourself. Like you're constantly thinking like, what can I get personally out of church? Like, why do I attend church? Is it because the music's great? Is it because the band is awesome? Is it because the live stream is awesome? Is it because the preaching is great, or he's a great communicator? Is it because of all these things that are focused really on what do I desire to get out of a church service or a worship service? So it becomes very self-centered in that way versus the focus being on God. He's the one we're coming to worship, and then others second. We are stirring up one another to love and to good works. We're strengthening the body's faith. We are doing all of these things, bearing one another's burdens because we're together. So I would say the first is focus, but the second is structure. When a member comes to us and is like, hey, we need this specific ministry, they are looking at church from a different structural standpoint than we as the staff would. So instead of like a top-down structure where, you come to a larger church with 50 staff members, like they just add another staff member to cover that ministry, start it, and then work its way down into the membership, which then leads to burnout. People who really aren't called to do that ministry are asked to participate, and then over time they burn out. Versus preaching the gospel, it being about God first, and the structure being that a member in the church feels called by God to start a ministry, and organically that happens. They're passionate about it. They love the Word of God, and they want to use it in this particular application, like a college group or whatever, young adults ministry or whatever. And then that takes off, and they begin recruiting peers around them to join in that cause. And then we as a staff get to actually shepherd and encourage and play more of a supportive role than the strategist in that sense.
Yeah. And again, it's not wrong to have these groups,
Right.
These age groups. What we're saying, though, is don't start there. That's really not what the church is supposed to offer you. It's really what we can't offer you is this segregated, age-graded ministry on every possible level. It's unrealistic. It's really unbiblical because, again, it doesn't put you in relationships where older people can speak into your life. The older people need the younger people just as much, and vice versa. So the biblical model is you being in a community of all different kinds of people. So, again, okay to have those groups, but that's not really where we start. And I love what you're saying. If those groups form and they're organic, that's great, right? So
Right.
Every church I've ever been at, and I'm not picking on the college ministry, and we have a great college ministry here, thankfully. I appreciate the couple that runs it and does it, and they put into it. But every church I've ever been at, college students, if there's not something going on, they will come to leadership and say, we think that you guys need to start a college ministry. And I'm thinking to myself, you're 18 years old, you're an adult, you've been in church all your life. How about one of you lead it? I mean, is that beyond one of you? We're going to put you in the workforce not long from now. Some of you might already be in professional workforce. You're going to college. I mean, you're learning all kinds of things. And, it's funny because I thought this way. When I was in college, I thought, I don't have any time. I'm so busy. And then you realize, I remember my BSU director, Baptist Student Union director at Ole Miss, Keith Kading. He said, you think you're busy now. You just wait. And he was right. So I realized that only going to class from 8 to noon every day, like 3 days a week, was not busy, even though I had to study. So, they'll all say, I'm so busy. Well, everybody's busy, right? Add 3 kids to that and a marriage and mortgage, you'll be busy. And then add all the other complexities of life. So, so what the church really can't do is indefinitely just keep adding plus ministries. That's not really our calling. That's not really our job. It's unrealistic to start there, right?
Yeah, and I think the reason why college ministry is, kind of always like the go-to example, well, it's my fault and it's youth ministers' fault and how we usually handle youth ministry. What we like to do in student ministry is we like to really segregate people as much as possible, right? We build a youth room and we put it upstairs as far away from everyone else as possible. And we have all different activities that are just for the youth. And we have camps that are just for the youth. And we have services that are just for the youth. And we don't let any adults in there because we're like, no, get away. This is our fun thing. And people really like that, and they really respond to it. They're like, see, we have a strong youth ministry. They're always together. They're always doing their own thing. And it's important to have, especially that age, like a strong youth ministry. But the failure and the temptation of turning into a ministry plus church is what happens when they graduate out of the youth ministry? What happens when they turn 18 and they have been used to their whole life of thinking, I have my own segregated ministry that's completely isolated from the rest of the church. Lifeway did a study a few years ago to try and figure out how come so many young people, once they graduate, once they leave the youth ministry, don't go back to church. And the number one response wasn't that they wasn't that they had struggled with their faith. It wasn't that they hated the church. It wasn't that, the church was full of hypocrites or anything. They simply said they didn't feel connected. They didn't feel like they were really members of that church. And so you're always trying to strike this balance of how do we develop culture and community in our little group, but also make sure that they're so connected with the church that when they're 18 or 19, right, and they're like, well, I'm no longer in youth ministry, do I have adults in the church that I look up to, that I'm friends with, that have poured into me so that I can go to their Sunday school class and feel like I have a place to belong? And for a lot of us, our youth ministries, student ministries, and children's ministries are so isolated that when they get to college, it's like, what? I'm just supposed to be a part of the body now? I don't know how to handle that.
And all their friends have moved away,
yeah,
gone to other places, and those that are left feel isolated, like you're saying.
Yep.
And again, I want to keep saying this. It's not wrong for them to have friends their age and have people. They need that. But really the focus of church is to be a part of this bigger community where you know all kinds of people and they pour into you.
And I think that last night in our last night for us, I don't know when people are going to be listening to this, but this past...
Well, hold that thought. So let's move into the second question. So we've kind of talked about what the church can't do. The church really can't start from all the pluses and try to add every possible segregated plus to bring community. But what can the church do? The church can try to connect people across the board. That's biblical. It's found in Titus 2. It's a model. The older pour into the younger bless the older, and you get to know all different kinds of people. So now, Jake, let's talk about last night, because you're right. People may be listening to this months from now, so try not to date it. But we have a men's ministry. And this men's ministry has intentionally subdivided our men intergenerationally. So like I'm in a group this particular season with 2 guys that are college age, 1 guy that is in his late 70s, 1 guy that's in his 30s, and 1 guy that's in his 50s. and I am 25. So we have all this group that's there, this multiplicity of men. And we're sitting around going through Scripture, talking about the biblical mandate of what God calls men to do. And these relationships start forming between these guys that are all these various ages. And I don't mean to steal your thunder, but one of the young men said to our group last night in particular, he said, I'm so looking forward to being in this group because 4 of you men in this group, you have been where I'm going. You've had children, you've had a career, you have gotten married. I want to do that one day, Lord willing. So I'm excited to learn from you and hear what you have to say. And I just shot back and said, well, we actually also want to feed off you because we need your youthfulness and your encouragement because we forget those things. We become very rigid in our old age. So we need each other. So after that meeting, a bunch of people go, and why don't you describe that? Because I think that's where you were headed.
Yeah, so at the meeting, we have this sense of a structured ministry where we're intentionally dividing people up into smaller groups because we had like between 80 and 100 guys there last night. Like it was just a massive turnout, all these guys. And you can't have a small group with 100 guys, right? So we divide up the small groups and we make it intergenerational. And so like in my small group, like Jerry Cherry was the one who was leading that small group. Now, Jerry Cherry is a few years older than I.
Just a few.
Just a few. Maybe a little bit more than a few. But here's the truth. Like being in that group, that was just a blessing to me, just as a minister, being able to hear just some of that wisdom that comes of having faithfully walked with Jesus, not for a few years, not even for a few decades, but for a lifetime. Like that means a lot. There's some things that I cannot give, that I cannot teach. There's some things that I can only learn from someone like Jerry Cherry. So we have this structured group, which is good, but then we do something that I think is so important. When those groups were over, around like 5:30, a bunch of guys, we just went out to eat. We went to Wimpy's down the road. I'd never been there. They had great burgers. I enjoyed it. But here's the thing. When I went to Wimpy's, I was sitting with a completely different group of guys than who was in my small group. And I was sitting with some younger folks and some older folks. And I want you to know that time of organic fellowship, where we were also doing ministry, we were also talking about the book we were going over, but we were also just pouring into each other. That time with that group after the ministry is just as important and just as vital as the small group structure time within church. Because at the end of the day, our goal in developing this compelling community is to make sure that we're united by the gospel in such a way to where you can have an 80-year-old, a 40-year-old, and an 8-year-old all in the same room, all learning to walk with Jesus together. And that's that intergenerational compelling community. And I also want to say that I think the reason why I'm already enjoying my small group so much with Jerry Cherry as a leader is because that small group time of him leading was not the first time I had a good conversation with Jerry Cherry. He has come before, and we've gone out to lunch before and just gotten to know each other. That time is important. We were together at Calvary Rescue Mission this past Thursday. That time is important of being able to do ministry together. And so I think it's this balance of we want to have structured community to where people can get to know each other and get plugged in, but we also want to make sure that we're using that to feed more organic community, because a lot of good ministry gets done when you're just going out to get lunch with someone. A lot of great ministry gets done where you're going to a basketball game and you're just talking with parents. That's where a lot of great Titus-style ministry gets done.
And, maybe there'll be organic conversations that lead to hospitality. Hospitality is definitely a New Testament term. It's something that's encouraged among pastors and among believers. So, what about, I'd love to invite you over to our house and we'll grill hamburgers and hang out and watch the game or play a game or whatever we do. And, hopefully that comes out of it. So, you don't always have to have a name and a Bible study at 8 o'clock on Thursday night to make it a group of connection and community. The church can offer you intergenerational community centered around the gospel, not centered around your hobby or your age or your particular interest, because we will never be able to fully meet everybody's age, everybody's interest, everybody's need. But what we can do is we can promise you that if you come here, we will have God's people willing to do life with you. And to quote one particular politician, it will take a village to raise you, and it will take a village of God's people coming together to, so quote unquote, raise one another in community. And that's what we are hoping for. And that's what we want. But that's a very countercultural concept today, isn't it? It's very countercultural. Churches don't really talk about that. At least I don't think so. It's more of the program-driven model.
Yeah, I think
Gospel plus.
Two things. One, and this is a temptation for everyone in any business, but I would say especially in ministry, I think a lot of the program-driven church life, for one, it really feeds egos, to be honest with you, because they feel like as a person who is leading a church, they have to plan out every single detail of that church's lifespan, and including what families are doing, how they're spending their time, and all of that. And to me, that can be very dangerous and counterproductive in a biblical sense, because what we're saying is that this structure that we have going right now, specifically with men's ministry, is just a launch pad. It is not, we may not have a men's ministry small group like this meeting on a weekly, biweekly, or monthly basis, but right now it is what our church needs to build relationships in the men of our church, so that moving forward, new things can start, new relationships, new ministries can start through the men in our church who are focused on God first, their families, how to shepherd and lead their families well, and then how to pour into each other as this brotherhood. So I think, in a sense, churches have become this because they have that ego-driven, like, we are planning every moment of every day of our lives, and to me that can be a detriment to the organic, biblical, multi-generational community that we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I think that ego is the right word for it, and not only just egos of the ministers trying to plan out and be the puppet masters of the whole church, but also egos when it comes to our church members. If we have this gospel plus consumer driven mentality, we can treat church like a fast food place. We can treat it like Burger King, like have it your way. And here's the problem. Well, here's one of the problems with that. If you think that the church exists to simply give you what you want, that means that you're never going to be willing to allow the church to speak real hard truths in your life, because you just want it your own way. You want whatever diet you feel like being fed. And so as churches pursue like that gospel plus model, as they try to be everyone or everything to everyone, and really focus on that consumer driven, have it your way, we have a ministry for every single individual, what ends up happening is they become so focused on being mass marketable, on getting so many thousands of people in attendance, that the actual spiritual diet, like McDonald's or like Burger King, ends up going down to where they never bother to feed you any vegetables. They never bother to feed you the healthy food that you need to eat. They're just giving you the fast food, what you want. And that's how you come up with adults that are spiritually very immature. And, they are going from church to church, always saying like, I want this out of a church. I want this out of a church. I want this out of a church. And that's not the model that we see in the New Testament. And that's not really good for the church, and it's not good for the church member. And so we want to strike that balance between having a gospel-centered intergenerational community and also providing opportunities for fellowship and community for people to get plugged in. But we have to strike that balance because, again, if we go too far to that consumer model, we end up never being able to feed people real good, healthy food. And we have a shallow church that is ego-driven. And on the other hand, if we don't provide the opportunities for community, if we never bother saying, hey, let's do a men's ministry of getting all these guys together so they can get to know each other, then you might have a visitor to the church who's like, you know what, I've been going to that church for 6 months, but I don't know anyone's name. And so how can you walk with Jesus together, and how can you pour into each other if there's never a time for you to really meet and there's never a time for you to get to know each other? And so I think that's really what we're trying to do here at Broadway. We're trying to strike that balance, and we're trying to do it in full wisdom and intentionality of let's have some structured ministry, but let's make sure that we don't sacrifice that organic growth that's so vital for a healthy, compelling community church.
Yeah. So listen to this. Before I went to Texas, I had the opportunity to go on staff at a pretty large church that shall remain nameless. And they needed a singles minister for the 40s and 50s age group. So they had multiple singles ministers. And this one particular position came open, and they said, now you're going to be the singles pastor to 40s and 50-year-olds. So I went and interviewed and, knew some of the guys that were working in that department, the singles ministry department. At the time, I was in my late 20s, maybe just turning 30, so I would have been about your age. And the guy that was taking me around the church and showing me this Galaxy-class starship, he's pointing everything out, and it's all impressive. And he says to me, now I'm just going to be honest. He says, everybody that's going to come to your ministry is going to have problems. Because if they're single in their 40s and their 50s, then they're going to have problems. Now, no offense if you're single in your 40s. This is what this guy says. Now, talk about encouraging me to take the job. So he tells me this. He's being completely honest. And he says, so you're going to really have to, probably do a lot of counseling, probably do a lot of ministry. You either have divorced people or you have people who, want to be married but aren't, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm thinking through this and I'm going, goodness gracious, do I really want to do this? Do I want to give the next several years of my life to be a singles pastor for a particular age group? Not just singles pastor, but for this particular age group. Am I even qualified to do this? Am I the guy to do this? So, I prayed about it and said, I think I'm going to go to Texas and be the pastor and preach. And it's smaller, but I'm going to go there, and that's what I'm going to go do. And never regretted that decision. But I think back to that, and I think back to your comment, Jake, about, what are we building when we put all kinds of people who kind of share some of the same problems? The mindset of the world is, well, that's good. They can all get together and feed off each other. But sometimes that's not what you need. You need to be around people, again, that can give enrichment and depth spiritually into your life. That may be people that are going through the same thing you're going through, but then again, it may not. And the church is never commanded, siphon off every age group and have a ministry for every possible thing. Instead, the church is commanded, make sure you're pouring into one another, love one another, be devoted to one another, share your spiritual gifts with one another. So there's a lot of one another's in the New Testament, and I think that that's what we're commanded to do. So going back to Wimpy's, Jake, last night, I'm sitting around with these guys that 2 of them are in my group, but 3 of them are not. And we're sitting there at the table, and one young man who I know his name, I know his family. We've talked, but we've never really gotten to talk. And so we're sitting there talking, and he's telling me these people that he listens to and these books that he's reading, and I'm blown away. And I said to him, I cannot believe that you're reading that book or you listen to that pastor. That's phenomenal. And I just felt like I got to know him sitting around Wimpy's. And I thought I would never have this conversation if he was always going to some other ministry, right? I would never get to know this person, and I want to get to know these young guys. I'm so encouraged by the young guys that I sat with last night at the Wimpy's Burger Place, because I thought, here's three young men that I think love Jesus. They're trying to be responsible. They're all right around the age of 20. They love Jesus. The conversation that was going on around the food was littered with the gospel. It wasn't about sports. It wasn't about what did you go do this weekend. It was about the gospel. And they were talking about the gospel. They were talking about how at work they had these opportunities to share the gospel and how they were so surprised by that, and how people say don't talk about politics and religion, and yet that's all people want to talk about is politics and religion. And so these young men were saying, so it gives me the opportunity to talk about Jesus. I just thought, man, what a blessing this is for me to hear these things and to get to know these guys and to have, some kind of a relationship with them that normally I wouldn't get to have. So I'm thankful for ministries that pull us together and not take us apart. So anyway, on that note.
Yeah, when people talk about our college ministry, our young adult ministry, I was like, well, part of that ministry was Wimpy's last night. Part of that ministry was us getting to know each other. Because here's the truth: if I can sit down and have a meal with someone and have a real conversation about what's going on in their lives, here's what happens: I immediately get their contact info on my phone, and I now have the right to call and check up on them. I now have the right to speak into their lives. And you can't form that kind of relationship. You can't form that kind of trust and accountability and brotherhood when you're always at a sanctioned church structured event. There's just something different about doing life together. And when Jesus is discipling his followers, what you see is he is constantly walking with them, talking with them, teaching them, not always in a structured way, but always together. And I think that if we as a church can get to the point to where we're always together, even if it's not in, technically, and I'm doing air quotes because y'all can't see me, like a structured, sanctioned church ministry event, like that's okay. As long as we're still pouring into each other, like that's okay. I'd rather have 100 conversations at Wimpy's talking about the gospel, talking about, well, how long should someone wait before they get married? Talk about, well, how do you provide for your future wife? Like talking about those kind of things. Man, that is, honestly, sometimes that's better than doing reading 2 chapters of a book in a Bible study.
Well, and I think that's part of our job as pastors. And Pastor Mark, you've talked about this before when we were reading the book, Compelling Community, is that it is our job to decide what parts of that structure need to be tabled for a season so that we're not over planning, so that we're not trumping those opportunities for members to get together organically like that and be able to pour and minister into other things. And the other thing I would say is kind of going back to the whole consumerism and that mentality is, I've heard like whatever antics a church uses to get people in the doors, that is what you will have to do to keep them there, which, that causes you to sacrifice a lot of things you may wish you hadn't.
So I think the bottom line is be open. If you're a church member or if you're visiting the church, be open to going to events that may not be specifically structured around you and your preferences, but are structured to give you gospel community in some way.
They may be for your good. I mean, you may not think they are good initially, but they may be for your good.
Yeah. So like Wednesday nights here, we have youth ministry and children's ministry going on, but we have a Bible study for all the other ages. And for a while, we kept getting on a particular social media platform a question, do you have anything for college kids on this night? And we would write back, yes, we have a Bible study that meets in the fellowship hall. And they would keep asking the question. And I think what they were wanting was They wanted this specific ministry with a name, and is that meeting tonight? Because I'm not going to come if that's not meeting tonight. And our response was always, yeah, we have a Bible study. It's for everybody. So I look out at that Bible study on Wednesday night, and there's like a table of young 20-something-year-olds all sitting around doing the Bible study with us. And I think, man, that's beautiful. That's great. They're a part of the larger body. They're coming. They're involved. You know, we don't have to have some special thing. This is special. This is good. They need to be a part of this. This is the life of the church. And so be open to doing that, right, guys?
Yeah, I think a great example on that Wednesday nights is we have a senior named Pete, and he might get on to me for
his real name is Paul. Paul.
Really? His real name is Paul?
His real name is Paul.
He's on my roll as Pete, and that's all I've ever called him.
Just trust me, it's Paul.
Well, here's what Pete did a few Wednesdays ago. Mark was actually talking about a subject dealing with these cultural issues that he was working on a paper with for school as a senior. And so he asked, is it okay if I go to the, adult but for all ages Bible study instead of going to youth group, because I'm really interested in this topic and I'm working on this paper? And of course the response is, well, of course you're allowed to go. How insane would it be for us to be like, no, you have to stay and you're age graded? Like, no, it is healthy and it is good for us to have that intergenerational church, and what unites us is the gospel. And so, what we said is like, it's okay to miss church to go to church. It's okay to miss youth group to go to the other Bible study, because we're here to focus, to learn about Jesus and God's word. And that's what unites us, not an segregated, age-gated ministry.
Amen. Well, on that note, we're going to end today's podcast, but we do want to let you know about our sponsors who have made this episode a possibility. Thanks to Wimpy's, who sponsored today's program, for Paul, not Pete, who sponsored today's program, for These Aren't the Droids You're Looking For, who sponsored this program, Star Wars, and for the megachurch that had the 40s and 50s single Sunday school class who sponsored this podcast. Thank you all for your support. Please pay them all your business and your patronage, because let me tell you, it is so expensive to put together a podcast on your computer and then freely upload it onto all the sites that are out there. So expensive to do that, right? Don't you? It cracks me up when podcasters, especially non-professional pastors, are the worst. This is sponsored by, and they have like a sponsor, and it's some dinky sponsor.
Blinds.com.
Yeah, and I'm like, why do you need a sponsor to do what you're doing? Anyway, okay, on that note, we're out.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Footnotes, a podcast hosted by the Broadway pastoral staff. For more information about our podcast or the church in general, please visit broadwaychurch.org. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care and have a wonderful week in the Lord.